Well, this is the second week, obviously, of our series, Brand New. And really what just happened is we ran out of titles for messages, and so we decided to call it Brand New. No, that's not true. But we just really believe that this is an important topic. And last week, we really kicked it off, and we set up what this whole thing is about. And so I'm just going to give like a short little, version, right? Like the Reader's Digest version. I'm going to just fly through it, so that you get a little bit of background if you missed last week. And again, I said this earlier in the service, but if you missed last week, I would encourage you strongly to go listen and or watch last week's message at TwoCities.Church. You can always find the messages there in like there's an on-demand section. So you can even binge watch. It's like Netflix, right? You can do that if you want. You won't do that. I'm just messing with you. But here's the thing. The arrival of Jesus signaled something that was brand new. Okay, it was brand new. When Jesus came, he signaled the end of the temple model. And last week we spent some time on the temple model. And here's kind of what the temple model is characterized by. It's four things. The temple model is characterized by sacred places, like there's a specific place you have to go to connect with a deity, to connect with a God. And by the way, these four things, this temple model is not just ancient Judaism, it's all ancient religions that this kind of follows. So all the contemporary religions that were around when Jesus showed up follow these same sorts of temple model rules and stuff. So the first one is sacred places. There's got to be a certain place you got to go to connect with God. Sacred text. There's a text that's like holy or other, or it's like an oracle or a prophecy of some kind, or someone smarter than the rest of us wrote it down and had some sort of special connection with God. And so there's a sacred text that you had to read. There were those sacred texts and those sacred places were guarded by sacred men. And it was always men, and they were the ones who could read these special texts, and they were the ones who could interpret these special texts so that everybody else could understand and relate and find meaning. And then the last one was it created sincere followers. Like I said, this is all ancient religions. It's not just ancient Judaism, but they all follow this kind of model. And you can even see this today in many parts of the world, and you can unfortunately see it today in many of our churches. And so we've been talking about how Jesus didn't intend for that to happen. And so Jesus initiated something that was entirely new. Say that with me. Entirely new. Okay, a couple of you were like, I'll say it. And the rest of you were like, I'm going to grumble. And it was a complete departure from the temple model. A complete departure. From the temple model. Thank you. And there would be no more sacred places. There would be no more sacred men. And a new relationship with sacred texts. So there still would be precious writings, but it would be a different kind of relationship with those texts. So it was brand new. And Jesus signaled something that was brand new, and there's kind of four new things that we kind of talked about last week. And that's a new covenant, or a new relationship, or a new arrangement with God, a new kind of idea, a new ideal centered with relationship with God, a new command. There would be one central command that if we could just follow this one command, it would like actually fulfill all the old commands. Like all 600 and something from the Old Testament. It can fulfill not only the 10 commandments that are so famous, but all the other ones that were made to protect the 10 commandments, so we didn't get close enough to violate one of the 10 commandments. All 600 something from the Old Testament. If we would just do this one thing, all that would be taken care of. It would be a new command from Jesus. Then there would be a new ethic. A new ethic. See, the old law would say things like, don't murder, don't kill someone. And the new ethic would be like, if you even thought about it, you've done it in your heart. So that's kind of a higher standard right there. But that would be the ideal. That would be what we would strive for, is not even thinking those things. And then there would be a new movement. And the new movement was defined by the word church, and we talked about last week how the word church doesn't even actually appear in the original language of the text. It was actually ecclesia, which meant gathering. And church was actually a German word that was reinserted back after the English translation, which means house of the Lord. And so house of the Lord was never meant to be the defining part of a gathering of the church. And so we're stuck with the word, so we use it because you're not getting rid of the word church. It's just it's not going to happen. We're not going to go around saying ecclesia all the time because no one's going to know, right? So, but it was meant to be a gathering place, a gathering of people, not even a place, a gathering of people, and not defined by a specific location or building or things like that. So I know that most of us, even today, as we were getting in our cars, we're like, hey guys, hurry up, we got to go to church. Which really what we should be saying is we got to go gather with the church, because we don't go to church, we are the church anyways. That's a whole other thing. We also talked about last week, the temple model was built around a standard that only the elite could meet. That only the elite could meet. Like the everyday person, you and I'm going to call myself an everyday person. Maybe you feel elite. I don't call myself an everyday person. I could not meet the elite standard that was put up by the temple model. And Jesus presented a standard that no one could meet, and he leveled the playing field, basically saying, listen, like I said before, there's a new command, there's a new way, there's a new ethic. If you've even thought about, then you've already done X, whatever it is. If you've even thought about killing someone, if you even have hatred in your heart, it's like you've murdered them in your heart, which we're all guilty of. So he leveled the playing field. So not even the elite could meet it, which means we all, including the elite, need the grace of God. We cannot, we could not, there is no way to meet that standard. We have to have the grace of God. So he brings that. You can't earn it. There's no way. That reckless love of God. The temple model required followers to come make peace with God. It required them to come have a sacrifice. It required them to come to a certain place of confession, right? Many of you have had that experience. You've gone to confession, and I understand the tradition of that. But you could just talk to God wherever you are. Like, you don't have to go somewhere to do that. You don't have to have a special person with you. There is a direct connection you can have with Jesus at any moment, anywhere, no matter what. So you don't have to go to a special place. The temple model required you to go to a special place, but Jesus said, I almost said Jolesis, that's a weird name. Jesus said, go make peace with your neighbor. So if you're in line to sacrifice an animal, which is what they did back in the day in the ancient Judaism, they sacrificed animals to pay for their sin. Or they went and they stood in the line to do it, right? At the temple, there was lots of people who had sin, right? And they all had to stand in line. He said, if you're in line and you're waiting and you realize you have an issue with one of your neighbors or somebody in your life and you're not right, he's like, God can wait. Don't worry about him. Go make it right with your neighbor. That's the Jesus ethic. The temple model was actually nation-specific. Nation-specific. Jesus declared that his message was for all nations. So the temple model followed a national God, right? There was a national God for all these nations back then, and they all had to go to their nation's capital or their nation's where they had the temple for their God, and they all had to connect with God there. They had to make a pilgrimage to that place to do it. And Jesus said, this is not nation specific. This is not just for Jewish people. This is for all people. All people. So, in the early days, we have some tension here. In the early days, Gentiles flocked to Jesus because he represented something new to them. They didn't have these notions of what God should be in terms of the Jewish God. They just flocked in. They're like, wow, this guy makes sense. I like what he has to say. But the Jewish Christians resisted the teachings of Jesus. Even though they were Christians, Jesus followers, they resisted. They could not let go of the old way. They could not let go. And so there was this tension in the early church where there's these people who were like fully on board with what Jesus says, and then there's people who are partially on board with what Jesus says, like they like Jesus, and they're like, he's good, he's one of our guys, but he's not as good as Moses. He's not as good as the prophet. Like, he's not as good as Isaiah. You know, he's up there with them, but I'm not sure he's above them. And so you have these tensions within the early church. And really, they felt like in order to move beyond the old law, in order to move into a Jesus ethic, into a Jesus law, right, they would have to give up completely their old law. And that felt like sacrilege. That felt like blasphemy. That felt like, I'm going to get struck with lightning if I say that. That's what that felt like to them. And that even feels like that to us sometimes. And that may feel like that to you this morning as we kind of dig into this a little bit more. And I get that because I've been there. But here's the deal. Our conscience determines religious realities for us. So how we feel about something determines our religious reality. How we see things determines our religious realities, whether they reflect reality or not. Right? All of us have these lenses that we look through. So in this room, you could put out any topic on the table right here, and you could divide the room many ways. Could we not? If I just brought up a topic and I'd say anybody who's for, go over here. Anybody who's against, go here. If you're not sure, go in the middle. And we, in this room alone, I am sure we are wall to wall, you know, as far as the east is from the west on some things. I'm positive, okay? But we all have these lenses, and our conscience informs that. And sometimes our conscience, because of the way that we were raised up, because of the way we were taught, because of the way that we heard preachers, or we heard people speak from the Bible, or we heard people take things out of context and apply it to the wrong things. Our conscience has been fine-tuned to accept and gravitate towards the temple model. I'm telling you, it is everywhere. If we're not careful, it is everywhere. And I'm guilty. And here's how you know you can kind of get there. Have you ever had anyone say, you shouldn't feel guilty about that? You shouldn't feel guilty about that. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't feel that way. You shouldn't. We're trying to get into a temple model when we're shoulding all over people. I didn't make that up. I've heard that before. The early Jewish Christians attempted to assimilate Jesus into the temple model. They said, like I said, he's like a really good guy. He's up there, but I'm not sure he's the guy. I'm not sure he's above. He's kind of right in there somewhere. I don't know where the pecking order is, but we'll include him in our religion. That's kind of what the early Jewish Christians wanted to do. They wanted to include him. Thankfully. And the reason that you and I, most of us, probably if not all, could follow Jesus or even hear about him is because another guy stepped on the scene in the early church and said, hold up, wait a minute, put a little love in it. Because he was Paul, the expert, the apostle Paul. He was the expert in the law. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was against the church, trying to kill the church. His name was Saul of Tarsus. And then God got a hold of him and said, what are you doing? Jesus appears to him on a road and says, stop. I choose you. Now you're going to build my church instead of kill my church. And Saul becomes Paul, and Paul becomes the greatest missionary in the first century. And he writes letters to all the churches that he plants and he participates in. He takes several missionary journeys around the known world at that time, and he starts churches. And people are like, isn't this Saul? I think I'm supposed to run from him, but now he's preaching the gospel to me. I'm not understanding what's happening. And he has a complete transformation. God changes him from the inside out. So he knows the temple model. He's the temple model guy. He wanted to kill Jesus, get rid of this other stuff And Jesus reaches out to him and stops him and uses him as the catalyst that would really launch the church beyond just Jerusalem and only Jewish Christians. He was the guy who took the message to the Gentiles, and that's the rest of us. And so Paul steps on the scene. He's a Pharisee. He understood the dangers of the temple model and how it was important to not import Jesus into that model, but he understood that Jesus represented something entirely brand new. And Paul, his mission was really attempting to completely transition the Jewish community, of which he was a member, away from a law-based approach to God and toward a love-based, grace-based approach. And his audience was pretty mixed on that subject. And his audience was not real sure, but we get a little glimpse of that in his writings. Because he knew that the temple model and the Jesus model don't mix. They just don't mix. So today we're going to dive in a little bit into a little bit of the text from Galatians, which is a letter he wrote to the church in Galatia. And he's explaining, it's actually one of the earliest writings of his. It may be the oldest that we have. It's an ancient manuscript. It's an ancient letter. But the reason I want to talk to you about this passage today and work through that a little bit is to help create a sense of urgency around what we talk about next week. So it's a little teaser for next week, all right? So don't miss next week, because today is really setting up next week. And it's pretty important. It's kind of central. It's a big deal. Because next week won't sit well with most of us. And you may be offended, and that's okay. Because I can understand that, and I've been there as well. But Paul's audience certainly was drastically offended as well. Our consciences, like I said, are strapped to things they don't need to be. Things like temple values. So let me tell you a little bit about Galatia, right, where he's writing. It was a region in modern-day Turkey. It was part of the Roman province. Galatians is the earliest, maybe the oldest, like I said, letter in Christian writing. The church was planted there on Paul's first missionary journey. And after he left, some other missionaries came through, some other people who were kind of Jewish Christians came through and kind of followed Paul after he went to a place and was trying to correct things into the temple model. Yeah, I know he said that. He's a little out there. He's a little bit too crazy. He had this experience with Jesus, not really sure. So I'm just going to bring you back more towards the middle. And so they're trying to correct a little bit of what Paul wrote. Paul said to them. So when he writes, he addresses these people, and in the writing, which these people were known as the Judaizers. Okay, he's even created a term for it. He's like, okay, I'm writing to this church, I'm writing to these Christians in Galatia, and there's some people who are messing up my message, and they're trying to take us back to a temple model. Those people are Judaizers. They're trying to make Jews out of all of you, but you don't have to become a Jew to follow Jesus, so they're mixing things. And so Judaizers are Christians who believe Gentiles had to convert to Judaism to join the Jesus movement. And that was complicated. And that required surgery for men. Okay? That required surgery. Required a little something extra. It's hard. It's difficult to do. And Paul hears about this, and when he hears about this, he becomes, and this is a great word, apoplectic. Apoplectic. Okay? And if you don't know what that is, great. None of us do. But I like it because it's got that little pop in the middle. And basically, he was about to pop. He was angry. He was so infuriated by this message. He was so mad, he almost popped. And it's a big deal. Because what these Judaizers were preaching diluted, and polluted the message of Jesus. It was creating something it was taking something that was amazing and trying to rein it in and trying to control it. And Paul said, no, you're messing it up. Stop it. Stop it. That's not what I preached. That's not the truth. You're taking us backwards. Stop it. So listen to Paul's urgency, and we'll start in Galatians chapter 5, verse 1. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Let me pause right there. Your version of Christianity doesn't make you feel freer, you're doing it wrong. You're doing it wrong. It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. So stand firm. Stand firm. Don't follow these sideways teachings of these Judaizers. Okay, stand firm then, and do not let yourselves be burdened again by a yoke of slavery. So the question is your religious experience, is your relationship with God liberating? Is it liberating? One of the inside values that I have for us here at Two Cities is that you would leave feeling more free than when you came in. That's one of my personal, that's what I want you to feel, that when you leave. More free than when you came in. Okay? I'm not always great at that, but I try. Okay? It's because of things like this, what Paul's saying here. Mark my words, I, Paul, as if they didn't know who it was from. I, Paul, he's telling them again, hey, it's me. I was the one who set this thing up, right? I was the one who brought this message to you in the first place. I have seen and talked to Jesus. I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, because that's the surgery they need to have, guys, in order to become Jewish, if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. Now, he's not making an argument against, like, the medical procedure of circumcision. I mean, how many guys in this room are just no, I'm just kidding. Please don't raise your hand. I thought about just letting that hang there for a minute, but he's telling his audience, this is a delayed reaction. If you're telling, let's collect ourselves. Okay, we'll get there. Okay. He says this. Let me say it again. If you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you at all. If you try to blend the old way and the new way, neither way is of any use to you. Neither way is of any use. It's not about the medical procedure. It's about what it represents. It represents a binding to the Old Testament law. It represents an old agreement with God. It represents an old covenant with God. And Jesus came along and said, I am the fulfillment of this covenant. This covenant is over. I am a new covenant. The old has gone. The new has come. See, some of you are like, what? What do we do with all that? Just hold on, we'll get there. Just relax. Tension. That's what his audience was feeling. Tension. See, it's a big deal. Paul's making a big deal about this. Verse 3, again I declare to every man who lets himself be circumcised that he is obligated to obey the entire law, the whole law, like all 600-something commandments. Good luck to you. Ain't gonna happen. But you can try. See, if you reach back for the old, you got to take the whole thing. You can't just take pieces. You got to take the whole thing. You can't pick and choose. And if you do that, you're abandoning the new and attaching yourself to the old. You're either all in or you're not in at all. That's what Paul's saying. And that's harsh. That's where he's at. Verse 4, you who are trying to be justified by the law, have been alienated from Christ. This is strong language, is it not? Alienated from Christ. You have fallen away from grace. What he's saying is, if you're trying to be justified by following all the Old Testament law, you are not relying on the grace of God. You are saying, I can do it. I got it. I can check all the boxes. I can follow the whole law. I can do it on my own. What Paul's saying is, no, you can't, and you need the grace of Jesus. And why would you want to be burdened by that? If you add the law approach to the grace approach, you end up with all law and no grace. Like, it just spoils the whole thing. Here, let me give you an example. If you came up to me and you're like, hey, I appreciate you. Don't know why, but I appreciate you, and I want to give you a $100 gift card to some restaurant. And I'm like, hey, I really appreciate that. Let me just, can I just give you $50 to help out with that? You know, I really appreciate that. Here's some cash for that. And you're like, no. And I'm like, how about 25? I'll give you 25. You're like, no. How about 15? Okay, I'll take 15. What we've done is we've taken away the gift and we've made it a discount, right? We've taken away the gift of the card and we've made it a discount card. When we try to blend the old with the new, that's what we do. We take away the free gift of Jesus. We try to make it a discount. It cheapens the grace of God when we're trying to fulfill the whole law. It cheapens the grace of God. The moment you mix or you blend Jesus in the temple model, Paul did say, you've fallen from the grace. You're not even looking for it. You're not even accepting it. You're not even living in that. Verse 6, For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. So that's not like are you in test? If they've ever had a group of friends that are involved in, seen that, right? It only takes a small dose of the wrong thing. And here's what he says to illustrate that. In verse, let me back up. Verse 7, you were running in a good race. You're running in a good race. He's talking to people, you're running a good race. Who cut in, he's using a little wordplay there, who cut in on you to keep you from obeying the truth? Like, who came in there and like circumcised the truth? Verse 9, a little yeast, like a single cell fungus, a little tiny yeast works through the whole batch of dough. Meaning just a tiny pinch of the wrong thing corrupts the whole thing, or changes the whole thing, or makes the whole thing different than it intended to be. Only a little bit. And as for those agitators, you can tell he's just getting so worked up. As for those agitators, if he could have, he probably would have used some curse words in there. As for those agitators, I wish they would just go the whole way. What do you mean? And emasculate themselves. See, that's in there. You should read the Bible. Okay, that's in there. He says that. As for those agitators, if they're going to start cutting, just keep cutting. He's getting mad because he knows what they're doing, and he understands what is at stake here. And if you're going to start cutting, cut it off. And he uses the emasculate is actually a Greek word here is apokopto. To cut as to take a separation, cut off, cut away. See, you should put your kids in children's ministry. That's a bit strong, Paul. That's a bit strong, okay? You're a little bit off the rails. You're a little bit out there. And he's like, you have no idea what's at stake. I can see where this is headed because I've been involved in the temple model and I understand legalism and I understand how this can get out of hand real quick. And there's going to be an expert and there's going to be subordinates, and then nobody's going to be on the same playing field. There's going to be people who are self-righteous, and there's going to be people who feel like they can never measure up, and it's going to be this massive gap. And then these people who feel like they can't measure up are going to have to go talk to the righteous people to make sure they're okay with God, when really God's saying you're good, love one another. You're going to mess it up. That's what Paul's saying. If we drag even a little bit of the old along with the new, the old will win out in the end, and we'll end up with legalism. None of us want to be there. See, Paul knew this. because he was front and center in the first century temple model. Before he became a Christian, before he followed Jesus, before he started planting churches, he knew this. He was in the temple model, and he knew these things. Leaders would become self-righteous. They become self-righteous. Followers would become hypocrites because there's no way they can live up to the teachings of the self-righteous. And the text would be manipulated and taken out of context, and the people would be mistreated. Who in here has been mistreated? By the church, even. By the gathering of God's people, because we allow the temple model to permeate our gathering, suffocate God's grace. Paul says the tragedy is by holding on to the old way, you actually miss the original intent of the old way. You miss it, which is kind of funny. If we cling to the old things, we miss the main thing, which is this. Verse 13. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Right? This doesn't mean like just go around and do whatever you want, because that's not loving, is it? That hurts people. But rather, serve one another humbly in love. So rather than asking ourselves, is this against the law? We ask ourselves, is this loving? Is this helpful? It's a different way of living. We're not living to see what we can get away with. We're living to see how we can add value to. That's the Jesus way. That's the loving way. It's not about just bumping up against, seeing how close we can get to the breaking the rules without actually breaking them, which is, what we all did as teenagers. At least that's what it looked like on the outside. We're just outright breaking them. But, we're trying to get as close there as possible, right? Without getting caught or passing that line, whatever it was. Instead of trying to get as close as we can to that line, we say, well, what's the loving thing to do here? What's the loving thing to do? How does this help people? How's that going to make that person feel? It's a different way. It's a different ethic. It's a Jesus ethic. And he says this at the end of there, verse 14. He says, "For rather serve one another humbly in love, for the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command." This one thing, everything, all the Old Testament, all the laws, keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. I thought about doing something really drastic. Just coming up here and saying, okay, today's message is just this. Love. And then just walking off. But you wouldn't have any context, you wouldn't understood. But that's simply what Paul is saying here. Love your neighbor as yourself. And what's really interesting is he's actually quoting a line from Leviticus in the old law. But it was buried. There was so much stuff on top of it, you couldn't even get to it. So he brings it back out. He says, look, this is the original intent. We've really bogged this thing down. So Jesus set us free. Love your neighbor as yourself. It was there the whole time. This wasn't something new, right? This was something that had gotten swallowed up by everything else. The greatest command which Jesus gives us is a dual command. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. The rest is detail. We added that little last line. Love God, love your neighbor as yourself. I know you've heard that before. But I don't know if you've heard it in the context of, not through the temple model, through the Jesus model. And And when you're unloving to people, you break the entire law. That's why you need grace. Going back to verse 6. The only thing that counts is faith expressing itself through love. When you get this right, you're going to pray differently. You're going to see sin differently. You're going to see your neighbor differently. You're going to see your enemies differently. You're going to see those who you don't agree with differently. You're going to see all those annoying Facebook threads differently. When you get this right. My point today is this. Paul believed this was a really big deal. The mixing and matching leads to what we call preference. And Paul called it poison. So, imagine just for a moment. If instead of asking ourselves, is this against the rules? Or is this against the commandments? Or is this against what God tells us? Okay? Instead of asking those questions, you ask yourself this central question. We're going to talk about this in a couple weeks in much greater detail. But asking yourself this question: what does love require of me? In this situation, when you're at work and those same annoying clients come in, what does love require of me? When you're in an argument with your significant other or your spouse, what does love require of me? When you have a financial disagreement, what does love require of me? When your landlord says, you gotta be out in 30 days, and all you want to do is sock him in the face because that wasn't the agreement. What does love require of me? What does love require of me? I want you to ask that question. This is how it was always supposed to be. This is how it was always supposed to be. The Jesus model is not centered around hundreds of commands. It's centered around one dual command: love God and love others like you love yourself. And in fact, when Jesus said that, the second one proved the first. Love God by loving others. The second one gives credibility to the first. You can't love God if you don't love others. We're going to pick it up next week. It's going to be interesting. Come back. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this simple, central command. We thank you for giving Paul the courage to stand up, giving Paul the insight, giving him the experience, meeting him on that road and changing his path so that it could change all of our paths, so that we could know who you really are. I pray that we would let go of old things and we would grab hold of what is new, and we would ask the question, what does love require of me? Because that's all God wants. For me to act in love, just as he has acted on my behalf in love. Let us not question how or where we stand with you, but let us know with confidence that anyone who would die for us, we are good with. And help us to grow in our influence in our city so that more people would know our gracious Lord. In Jesus' name, amen. God bless you. We'll see you next week.